Hello, my name is John Voyer, Emeritus Professor of Business Administration at the University of Southern Maine. Today I'm going to discuss schools and the legacy of redlining. Systemic racism is a situation under which members of minority races experience deleterious outcomes, such as higher arrest rates or greater wealth inequities, stemming from explicit or implicit bias. Even though explicit bias is mostly illegal, systemic racism may still exist because of structures of policy or behavior that generate unnecessarily lopsided outcomes. One such systemic structure involves how school districts assign students to schools, using school attendance zones that may be vestiges of the now outlawed practice of redlining urban neighborhoods. Redlining was an overtly racist and discriminatory policy facilitated by a federal agency of the United States government, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, founded in 1933 as part of the New Deal. It commissioned residential security maps for scores of cities across the country. The term redlining came from how the maps used four colors to depict neighborhoods as belonging to four categories of loan risk: best in green, desirable in blue, declining depicted in yellow, and hazardous in red. Here's an example from Columbus, Ohio. Here's the residential security map. The area outlined in yellow contains two elementary schools with markedly different performance outcomes, which are located in different school attendance zones. These zones were in different neighborhoods on the 1936 HOLC map. One was green in the best, and the other yellow and red, declining and hazardous. In the United States, school districts are political subdivisions, typically defined in state law and governed by elected officials. Within districts, unelected administrators usually create school attendance zones, which are administrative service areas. Now, it turns out there are feedback loops between housing quality and school quality, because affluent parents look for good schools for their children and bid up the price of housing in school attendance zones that have those good schools. Parents who cannot afford expensive housing make do with the schools within their school attendance zones. What results is a patchwork of school attendance zones with different property values and schools of commensurate quality. Today's affluent school attendance zones with good schools often are in areas designated green or blue in the HOLC maps of 85 years ago. Today's failing schools are often in school attendance zones whose areas were designated yellow or red in those old maps. In this presentation, HOLC-A means formerly green areas, and HOLC-D means formerly red areas. Here's the example again from Columbus, Ohio. We have Clinton High School, which has an 87% reading proficiency score, and Como High School, only 1.2 miles away, with a 44% score. Here are the current school attendance zones, which, as you can see, the school attendance zones are basically divided by Interstate 71. And here's the HOLC residential map from 1936, and you can see that Clinton on the left, or to the west, was in a green zone, and Como was sort of in a straddle between yellow and red. This is just one of several examples from A Fine Line, which details many of these kinds of things in various metropolitan areas around the country. What were the causes of school performance gap? Was it funding? Revenues in HOLC-D school administrative zones were indeed lower than those in HOLC-A zones. However, because of federal funding provided to HOLC-D schools, their expenditures were not statistically significantly different from HOLC-A schools. What can the evidence from charter schools teach us about this performance gap? Research shows that it is possible to design and implement schools that, despite their location in formerly redlined areas, are high-performing. What's the key? The no excuses schools. Higher expectations for both academics and behavior from students, longer school days and years, and frequent observations by teachers to give feedback, tutoring, and data-driven instruction that uses assessment to frequently update teachers. Now, here is the conventional dynamic hypothesis, which shows that the quality of housing in a school zone directly affects the quality of the school in the school zone, which determines student performance which increases or decreases the quality of housing in the school zone, with the exogenous variable of the desirability of the school zone on the HOLC map designation. However, it's not clear that this link is a valid one. It's not clear that the quality of the housing in the school zone per se affects the quality of the school in the school zone. So it's not clear that this is a valid link. And here's the elaborated dynamic hypothesis. The three things I showed in the previous slide are still here, but now what we're saying is that the quality of housing in the school zone has a tendency to somehow affect the management attention to the school in the school zone. So if you have high quality housing, the management pays a lot of attention. If you have low quality housing, they pay less attention. To the extent that they pay more attention, you'll have the no excuses type of school that I was referring to earlier, and that will have two effects. It'll improve faculty skill, and it would also increase academic and behavioral rigor. Both of those things will affect the quality of the school in the school zone, and you get back to this reinforcing loop here, which is management attention to school attendance zone drives quality of school. And as I'm sure you realize, reinforcing loops can go in both good and bad directions. I just kind of described a good direction, but obviously if there's less attention paid, all of these things go down, and you end up with a reduced quality of housing and quality of schools. Obviously, if the quality of the school goes up, student performance goes up, and that makes housing more desirable, and therefore the quality of the housing in the school zone will go up, and you'll get this school quality drives housing quality phenomenon that has been noted in many studies. Now, before I get into the actual stock and flow model that I used, I simply wanted to point out that the basis of that model is it's a modified version of the Vensim quality model. So here's the overall model, and as you can see, faculty skill is over here. Quality of school in the attendance zone, this has been changed to a stock because it doesn't change quickly. Same thing with student performance in school attendance zone and the quality of housing. All three of these things were converted to stocks. But as you can see, there are many nonlinear functions. In fact, there's two that drive these various performances. The relative quality, for example, of schools, the relative quality of student performance, the relative quality of faculty skill, and so forth. Using that model, I ran a series of policy experiments, beginning with the baseline, which, as you can see here, there's a slight increase in housing quality over the period from 1970 to 2020, but that's in the green areas, but in the red areas, no increase. The quality of the school in the attendance zone also doesn't change much in the HOLC-D areas, but rises to a relatively high level in the formerly green areas. Student performance similarly, although in the case of the HOLC-D schools, there's a gradual decline, whereas there's a gradual increase and what appears to be a bit of a leveling off near the end of the period for the HOLC-A schools. Now, what if we were to introduce greater faculty skill and effort? As you can see, depending on whether you introduce it close to the beginning of the period, 1970, or later, 30 years later in the period, you get different outcomes. An early implementation of greater faculty skill and effort is shown in this red line, and there's a gradual improvement in the quality of the school. In terms of waiting until the year 2000, the green line, there's actually a bit of a dip that doesn't start to change until near the end of the period in 2020. In terms of student performance, we see the same kind of phenomenon where there's a much greater increase in student performance if we start the greater faculty skill and effort process earlier, 1970, as opposed to the year 2000. Now, what if we instead adopt a no excuses approach? And you can see that this is somewhat dramatic. Here's the HOLC-A school in gray right here. If we begin the no excuses approach in 1970, we get this red line, which closes the gap rather dramatically, and it's essentially closed by the year 2000. If, on the other hand, we wait until the year 2000, we don't begin to close the gap, and it ends up being closed much later in the period. And of course, the original HOLC-D zones had no improvement or minimal improvement in school quality. In terms of student performance, the no excuses approach also yields positive results for the HOLC-D zones. If we start in 1970, we begin an improvement process, which, while the gap between the D and the A areas is not closed, it's at least on a positive trajectory that did not exist under the original scenario. If we wait until the year 2000, we again begin an improvement, but it won't close the full gap until much later than the period shown here. What about school choice, which is basically the two combined? The faculty improved skill and effort, and also the no excuses approach. If we do that, we see that, and we begin it in 1970, we see that the improvement in the quality of the school in the attendance zone begins to improve rather dramatically and levels off relatively early. If we wait until the year 2000, we get a pretty good boost and end up in the same place. But in the meantime, there's a lot of students who are attending an inferior school where they didn't really have to. The quality of the school in the attendance zone also improves rather dramatically with the adoption of the school choice approach. The earlier, the better, again, as you can see here. Student performance similarly improves more dramatically under this approach, and again, the earlier, the better. Student performance in the school attendance zone is also quite a bit better if one compares it to the A schools, which is the blue line here. We see that starting the choice process early on nearly closes the gap in student performance by the end of the period. And if we wait longer, we don't close the gap as quickly, but it is closing. Interestingly, housing quality is also affected by this, because as schools improve, housing quality in a particular attendance zone would also improve. So you can see here that using the no excuses approach in 1970 improves the quality of the housing quite a bit. Waiting until the year 2000 improves it, but not quite as much. So what are the conclusions of all these different scenarios that were simulated? First of all, much evidence has shown that the longstanding practice of redlining, despite being outlawed in 1968, nevertheless has had lingering effects on current conditions. Those include housing quality and value itself, but also the quality of schools in those school attendance zones that overlap formerly redlined areas. We examine the systemic structure of this situation, positing that it is not the quality of housing per se that has led to failing schools. They come from the lack of administrative effort to enforce good academic and behavioral standards and to support high effort from faculty. The policy experiments in the stylized model used in this paper simulated improved faculty effort alone, improved academic and behavioral conditions, the so-called no excuses approach alone, and a combination of the two. The results show that significant improvements in school quality and in student performance are modest with improved teaching, significant with the no excuses approach alone, and high with the combined approach. Indeed, the combined approach closed the gap between HOLC-A and HOLC-D zones in school quality. For student performance, the gap remained after implementation of the combined approach, but the trend was in the direction of closing it. For some charter schools in New York City and elsewhere, this combined approach has already closed the quality and performance gaps.